The sound of my son-in-law's palms slamming down on the Thanksgiving table rattled every dish in the room and sent my granddaughter's apple juice straight into her lap. But it wasn't the noise that stopped my heart. It was what he said next. Leaning over my daughter with that practiced sneer. I'd watched him perfect for 3 years. His voice low enough that he thought only she could hear it. You open your mouth one more time tonight, and I promise you won't like what happens when we get home. My daughter Claire was 31 years old. She had her mother's green eyes and her grandfather's stubborn chin. And in that moment, sitting at my dining room table with her 7-year-old daughter watching from across the room, she went very, very still. The way an animal goes still when it knows a predator is close. Not defiant, calculated, practiced. Like she'd learned exactly how much stillness was required to make the danger pass. I recognized that stillness. 40 years ago, I'd seen it in case files. Now I was seeing it in my own child. My name is Harold Garrett. Most people call me Hal. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 37 years as a federal auditor before I took early retirement to my house on the edge of Franklin, Tennessee. I'd spent nearly 4 decades following money through shell companies, nonprofit scams, inflated contracts, and creative bookkeeping that would make your head spin. I knew how to find the rot underneath a polished surface. I knew how to read a room, and I knew, sitting at the head of my own Thanksgiving table, that my daughter had been living inside something very wrong for a long time. Let me go back a little. Claire married Brandon Whitfield 2 years after her mother, my wife Beverly, passed away from cancer. I'll be honest, I was grateful for the timing and the way a grieving man grasps at things. I told myself he made her smile. I told myself I was too deep in my own loss to judge clearly. My sister Carol told me I was being too hard on a man I barely knew. My old colleague from the auditor's office, a retired investigator named Ted Pearson, sat on my back porch one evening about 6 months into their marriage and said, without any particular drama, Hal, something's off with that guy. I told Ted he was being suspicious by habit. Occupational hazard. I should have listened. Thanksgiving had been Claire's idea. She wanted the whole family together, me, Carol's husband Frank, their 2 grown boys, and Brandon's business partner Gary Slocum, and his wife Renata, who Claire had inexplicably started calling her close friends, even though she'd known them less than a year. I'd set up the folding tables in the living room. I'd smoked a turkey for 8 hours. I'd made Beverly's cornbread dressing from memory and cried a little while I did it. The first crack appeared before we even sat down. I'd noticed Claire's wrists when she'd come in through the kitchen door. Long sleeves, despite the fact that Franklin in late November is mild enough for short ones. When I hugged her, she winced slightly on the right side, then immediately covered it with a laugh and a comment about the kitchen smelling wonderful. My granddaughter Emma had sprinted straight to my sister Carol without stopping to hug her mother. Kids notice things adults work hard to unsee. Brandon had walked in behind them carrying a bottle of wine he'd selected, he told me, from a specialty shop in Nashville. He shook my hand too firmly. He called me sir twice. He was dressed better than anyone else in the room, pressed slacks, a jacket, the kind of studied casual that costs money, and he looked around my house with the particular expression of someone reminding themselves to be patient. Dinner was fine at first, the kind of fine that requires effort. Carol's boys talked about football. Frank helped me carry out dishes. Gary Slocum told a long story about a property deal that had apparently gone very well, and Brandon laughed at the right moments with the ease of someone who already knew the story. Then Claire mentioned the new job. She'd been offered a position at a pediatric practice downtown. Office manager. A real salary. Benefits. Something she'd told me about in private 3 weeks earlier with more excitement than I'd heard from her in years. She brought it up carefully at the table. The way you test ice before you put your full weight on it. I've been thinking I might go back to work, she said, mostly to the table rather than to Brandon. Dr. Okafor's practice in Brentwood. They offered me the office manager position. There was a pause. Not long. Maybe 2 seconds, but I was watching Brandon's jaw, and I saw it go tight the way a fist goes tight before someone uses it. We've talked about this, he said. His voice was pleasant, conversational, which was what made it so ugly. I know, but the timing feels right now that Emma's older and I said we talked about it. He set down his fork, not hard, deliberately, and then he put both hands flat on the table and leaned slightly forward and said those words that I will never in my life unhear. You want to embarrass me in front of everyone? Fine, but you forget your place one more time tonight, and I promise you won't like what happens when we get home. The table went quiet. My granddaughter Emma was staring at her plate. I looked at my daughter. She had gone still. Gary Slocum cleared his throat and picked up his wine glass. He looked at Brandon not with surprise, not with discomfort, but with the blank recognition of someone who has witnessed this particular performance before and knows their role is to wait for it to pass. His wife Renata studied her placemat. Carol looked at me. I looked at Brandon. And 37 years of watching people hide what they were doing with other people's money told me with absolute clarity that what I was seeing at my Thanksgiving table was not a man having a bad moment. It was a man who had been doing this long enough that he no longer bothered to lower his voice all the way. I stood up from the table. Brandon, I said, why don't you come help me get the pie? He looked up at me. Something crossed his face, the recalibration of a man who had momentarily forgotten whose house he was in. Sure, Hal. Easy smile. Like a switch flipped. In the kitchen, I took my time with the pie server. I could hear the low murmur of Carol rescuing the table conversation behind us. When I turned around, Brandon was leaning against the counter with his arms crossed, wearing that smile. I want to be honest with you, I said. Of course. What I just heard in there concerned me. He shrugged one shoulder, dismissive. Claire and I have our communication style. Every couple's different. I wouldn't read too much into it. She was wearing long sleeves. She runs cold. Always has. She flinched when I hugged her on the right side. Brandon's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. Just slightly, the way a screen flickers before the power goes out. I'm not sure what you think you're implying, Hal, but I'd be careful. Claire's a happy woman. What goes on in our marriage is between us. Not when you bring it to my table, I said. And not when my granddaughter is watching. He straightened, uncrossed his arms. You know, I've heard stories about you. Spent all those years looking for problems that weren't there. I think it becomes a habit. You start seeing fraud in everything, even in family. He picked up the pie. Let me take this out. I let him go. I stood in my kitchen for 60 seconds and made a decision. I went to my study and found my old contacts notebook, the physical one, the kind I kept because I didn't trust everything to a phone. Near the back, under P, I found the number I was looking for. Diane Park. She'd retired 3 years before me from the Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Inspector General. We'd crossed paths on a joint investigation in 2019, and she'd told me, the way people in our line of work sometimes tell each other things, to call if I ever needed eyes on something in Tennessee. I texted her one sentence, need a quiet favor. You have 10 minutes? 3 dots. Then, call me. I stepped out onto my back porch and dialed. I told Diane what I'd seen at the table. I told her about Brandon Whitfield, the business partner Gary Slocum, the property deal story at dinner, the specialty wine, the jacket. Then I told her the thing I hadn't told anyone yet, what Claire had mentioned to me in passing 2 months ago, the thing I'd filed away and not known what to do with. Brandon ran a company that managed referrals for home healthcare services. He'd described it to me once as a consulting business. He helped connect patients discharged from hospitals with home care providers. Medicaid patients, mostly. There was a silence on Diane's end of the line. What's the company called? She asked. Bridgeway Care Solutions. Another silence. Longer this time. Hal, she said. Don't let those 2 men leave tonight. I went back inside. I found Carol in the kitchen refilling the sweet tea pitcher and told her quietly, without drama, that I needed her to help me keep everyone at the table for another hour. She looked at my face and said, Okay, Hal. The way she'd been saying that to me our whole lives. Gary Slocum was telling another story when I sat back down. Brandon was watching Claire with the patient attention of a man who was keeping score. Emma had moved to sit next to Carol's youngest son, who was teaching her a card trick, and I was grateful for that. An hour and 20 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. 2 people, a woman I'd never met, mid-50s, in civilian clothes but with the bearing of someone who had spent a long time in federal service, and a man about her age in a fleece vest, carrying a leather messenger bag. She introduced herself as Diane Park and said her colleague's name and that they'd come at the request of Harold Garrett. Brandon's face went carefully neutral. Gary Slocum set down his wine glass. "I've invited some colleagues of mine to finish the evening with us," I said to the room. "I hope that's all right." Diane pulled me aside into the hallway. She spoke quietly, precisely, the way people do when the information is serious and the time is short. "Bridgeway Care Solutions," she said. "We've had a referral flag on that company for 8 months. Billing irregularities, home health visits billed to Medicaid for patients who were already deceased. Services marked as delivered on days that don't match provider logs, kickback payments, structured as consulting fees moving through a property management LLC in Gary Slocum's name." "How much?" I asked. She told me the figure. I kept my face even. "And the patients? That's what concerns us most. Some of the people allegedly receiving these services are real. Elderly. Largely homebound. Primarily in rural counties. We have reason to believe some of them have been essentially abandoned by care providers who were being paid to see them. One woman in Maury County hadn't had a documented home visit in 4 months. Her daughter reported it as neglect. I thought about my granddaughter sitting next to Carol's son learning a card trick. I thought about Claire going still at the table. I thought about Brandon's smile in my kitchen. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Right now? We'd like to speak with everyone here informally. Nobody's under arrest tonight, but we'd appreciate if you could ensure cooperation while we make some calls and get some documentation moving." I nodded and went back to the dining room. "Brandon," I said, "Diane would like to speak with you in the living room." He looked at Gary. Something passed between them fast, practiced, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. "I'd like to know what this is about before I agree to anything," Brandon said. "Bridgeway Care Solutions," I said simply. The color left his face. Not all at once. Gradually, like a tide going out. Gary Slocum stood up so quickly his chair scraped back hard against the floor. "I need to make a phone call." "You're welcome to use the porch," I said. "I'd ask that you stay on the property." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he sat back down. Claire had been very still since Diane and her colleague walked in. Now she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face in years. Something opening up, very slowly, like a window that had been painted shut for a long time. "Dad," she said quietly, "what's happening?" "Something that should have happened earlier," I said. "I'm sorry it didn't." Over the next 2 hours, my house became something I hadn't expected to host in retirement. Diane and her colleague worked the living room with the methodical efficiency of people who had done this many times. 2 more people arrived, a younger woman who introduced herself as being from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, and a man from the Medicaid Fraud Control Unit who shook my hand and thanked me for the call. Carol took Emma upstairs with a promise of hot chocolate and board games. Frank helped me stack the dinner dishes without either of us saying much. Carol's boys sat on the back porch and periodically checked in with looks that asked if I needed anything. Brandon spoke to investigators for 40 minutes. I wasn't in the room, but I could see his attorney arriving, a man who looked like he'd been called away from his own Thanksgiving dinner and was furious about it, and I could see, from the way Brandon walked out of the living room 15 minutes after that whatever composure he'd arrived with was gone. Gary Slocum didn't last as long. His wife, Renata, had been sitting in the kitchen with a cup of coffee I'd poured her, and when one of the investigators came to speak with her separately, she started talking before they'd finished their first question. She'd known, she said. Not all of it, but enough. She'd been scared for 2 years of what Gary and Brandon were doing, scared of what they were capable of, scared of what it meant for her if she said anything. She looked at me across the kitchen table at one point and said, "I used to think about saying something to Claire, but I didn't know how." I said, "You're saying something now." Later that night, after the investigators had left with Brandon and Gary in separate cars, not in handcuffs, not yet, but with the kind of firm direction that left no room for misunderstanding after Renata had been driven home by the TBI agent who promised she'd be in contact, after Carol had gotten Emma settled in the guest room with Beverly's old quilt, I sat with Claire in the kitchen. She had both hands around a mug of chamomile tea. She still had the long sleeves on. How long? I asked her. She didn't pretend not to understand. The controlling stuff started pretty early. The first year, telling me what to wear, who to spend time with, checking my phone. She paused. The first time he actually hurt me was about 18 months ago. 18 months. I thought about every phone call we'd had in those 18 months. Every time I'd asked how things were going and she'd said, fine, busy, good, we're good. Every time I'd almost said something and then decided I was reading too much into what I was seeing. He told me his family had connections, she said quietly. He said if I tried to leave or if I told anyone, he'd make sure custody went his way. That I'd look unstable. That he had people who would back him up. She looked at her tea. I kept thinking I'd find the right moment. The safe moment. There's never a safe moment for that, I said. That's how it's designed. I know that now. She looked up at me. How did you know about Bridgeway? The business? You mentioned it once. 6 months ago. You said he'd asked you to scan some documents for him. Billing stuff. And that the numbers seemed off to you, but he told you not to worry about it. She stared at me. I said that once. In passing. I wrote it down, I said. Old habit. I wrote it down, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I'm sorry it took me until tonight. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You didn't let him leave. No, he would have made it very bad, she said. If he'd gotten home tonight and I'd been the one who said something, he would have made it very bad. I reached across the table and put my hand over hers. He's not making anything bad for you anymore. The investigation took 11 months. Bridgeway Care Solutions had been running a multi-layered Medicaid billing fraud scheme for 4 years. They had billed for home health visits that never occurred. They had enrolled deceased patients in care programs and collected monthly payments. They had paid kickbacks to hospital discharge coordinators in exchange for referrals, routing those payments through Gary Slocum's property management company in increments just small enough to avoid automatic flags. The total fraud, just under $4 million. But the part that made the case go from significant to something the Department of Justice wanted to put its full weight behind, the part that mattered most to me, was the real patients. There were 63 of them, elderly men and women, most of them on fixed incomes in rural Middle Tennessee, who had been officially enrolled in home care programs and who were having that care billed to Medicaid every month. Except the care was not being delivered. The providers were being paid and not showing up. Some patients had family members nearby who were covering the gap without knowing they were entitled to actual services. Others didn't. 3 patients had been hospitalized for conditions that proper in-home monitoring would have caught earlier. One 81-year-old man in a small town outside Columbia had died. When the investigator told Claire that detail, we were sitting in the U.S. Attorney's office in Nashville, and Claire was preparing to go over her testimony. She went very still for a moment, not the old stillness, the survival stillness, but the stillness of someone absorbing something that required a minute to hold. Then she said, I want to make sure that's in the indictment. The assistant U.S. attorney said it was. Good, Claire said. And I want to testify. About all of it. The fraud and the rest of it. The attorney looked at her carefully. Mrs. Whitfield, you understand that his defense team will be aggressive about your credibility. They'll characterize the domestic abuse claims as motivation to fabricate, Claire said. I know. I've talked to my victim advocate about this. She had been working with a domestic violence organization for 6 months by then. She'd also started attending a weekly group. She'd also, in the 3rd month after Thanksgiving, rolled up her sleeve in my kitchen while I was making coffee and showed me the scar on her forearm and told me, in a level voice, exactly how it had gotten there. Let them try, she said. I have documentation they don't know about. She had been taking photographs for 14 months, stored in a cloud account Brandon didn't know existed, under an email address she'd made at the public library. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Claire testified for 2 days. Brandon's attorney did exactly what the U.S. attorney had predicted, built a narrative of a bitter wife, a vindictive father, a family using federal investigators as a personal weapon. He was skilled and he was precise, and he underestimated my daughter completely. Claire sat in that witness box, and she answered every question in the same steady voice. She walked the jury through the billing documents she'd scanned and hadn't understood. She described the meetings at their house, men she didn't recognize, late evenings, her told to stay upstairs. She described the night she'd heard Brandon on the phone saying the Maury County account needed to be cleaned up because a family was asking questions. She described 31 months of what her life had looked like, without drama, without performance, simply with the precision of a woman who had decided that truth was the most powerful thing she owned. When Brandon's attorney suggested she was exaggerating the abuse to gain sympathy, Claire looked at him calmly and said, "I have 4 years of medical records. I have photographs dated and time-stamped to within hours of each incident. I have text messages, which my husband sent from his own phone, that describe in specific terms what he would do to me if I ever spoke to anyone. I'm not exaggerating anything. I'm describing my life." The jury deliberated for less than a day. Brandon Whitfield was convicted on 11 counts: Medicaid fraud, conspiracy, kickback violations under the anti-kickback statute, obstruction, and wire fraud. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. The domestic violence charges at the state level added 8 more. Gary Slocum received 17 years. 3 discharge coordinators who'd taken kickback payments received sentences ranging from 4 to 7 years. 2 care providers who had billed for undelivered services received civil penalties and permanent exclusion from participation in federal health programs. Renata Slocum cooperated fully with investigators. She received immunity. The civil recovery process took another year. Brandon and Gary's assets, houses, vehicles, investment accounts, the LLC, were seized and liquidated. A restitution fund was established for the patients and families who had been harmed. The estate of the man who died received a settlement. I won't tell you that money repairs that kind of loss. It doesn't. But it was something. It was acknowledgement that his life had mattered and that what happened to him was not invisible. Claire and Emma moved back into my house for 7 months. Then Claire found a place of her own, a house about 12 minutes away. Small, with a yard Emma approved of after a thorough inspection. She took the job at Dr. Okafor's practice. She was good at it, better than she'd expected, and Dr. Okafor told me at a neighborhood event 6 months in that Claire ran the most organized office she'd ever worked in. I am not going to tell you that everything healed clean and fast. It didn't. There were hard nights. There were months when Claire was in therapy twice a week, and Emma was in play therapy once a week, and I was driving more than I thought a retired man could manage, and sometimes sitting in my car in a parking lot for 10 minutes before I trusted my composure enough to walk into wherever I was going. Grief and rage have their own schedule, and they don't check with you first. But I can tell you about last Easter Sunday. Claire and Emma came over, and we made Beverly's lemon cake from the handwritten recipe card I've kept in the kitchen drawer for 3 years. Emma stood on the step stool and operated the hand mixer with great seriousness, and Claire stood next to her, and they had a brief argument about whether the batter needed more zesting that Emma won decisively. I sat at the kitchen table and watched them, and thought about Thanksgiving 2 years earlier, the long sleeves, the stillness, the apple juice in Emma's lap, and I thought about the moment in the kitchen, when Brandon had leaned against my counter and told me I was a man who saw fraud where there was none, a man whose habit was suspicion, a man who should be careful. I thought about that, and I thought about Diane Park picking up my text on a Thanksgiving afternoon and calling me back in 3 minutes. I thought about Claire in that witness box saying, "I'm not exaggerating anything. I'm describing my life." After the cake was in the oven, Emma went out to check on the state of the garden, a project she had appointed herself to manage, with results that were enthusiastic, if not always technically successful, and Claire sat down across from me with 2 cups of coffee. "I got a call this week," she said, "from a woman whose mother is in one of the counties that was in Brandon's files. She tracked me down through the victim advocacy office. She said her mother is finally getting the actual care she was enrolled for, because of the investigation, because of the civil suit." She wrapped both hands around her mug. She wanted to thank someone. She ended up thanking me. I didn't say anything for a moment. "That's not something I expected," Claire said. "To have something come out of all of this that helped someone I didn't know. It's something," I said. She nodded slowly. I've been thinking about what I want to do going forward, beyond the office manager job. I've been talking to the advocacy organization about whether there's a role I could play in working with families who are navigating the legal side of things after a domestic abuse case intersects with financial crime. It's more common than people realize. It is, I said. More common than people want to know. You'd know better than most. I spent 37 years following money, I said. And the thing I learned, the thing that stayed with me, was that financial crime almost never lives alone. It lives with coercion. It lives with control. The money and the cruelty are usually the same person. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I want to thank you, Dad, for not letting it go that night. I should have seen it sooner. You didn't have all the pieces. I had enough of them, I said. I just didn't want to believe what they were telling me. That's on me. She shook her head. You acted when it mattered. You didn't hesitate when it was real and right in front of you. A lot of people would have let it go, would have told themselves it wasn't their place, would have said, well, it's a marriage. It's complicated. She looked at me. You didn't. From outside, we could hear Emma providing a detailed assessment of the raised bed situation in a voice that suggested things were not going as hoped for the early spinach. Claire smiled. The real one. The one that reaches her eyes. I thought about Brandon in my kitchen telling me I saw fraud where there wasn't any. About Gary Slocum refilling his wine glass and waiting for the moment to pass. About an 81-year-old man in a small town outside Columbia who had deserved better. About 63 names in a federal case file. Real people who had existed inside a system designed to help them and had instead been used as line items in someone else's profit margin. I thought about the one text I sent on Thanksgiving night and the woman who answered it in 3 minutes because we had spent our careers believing that someone had to pay attention, that someone had to follow the numbers wherever they led, that walking away was not something either of us had ever been built for. I'm 63 years old. I'm retired. I have a granddaughter who is conducting aggressive agricultural experiments in my backyard and a daughter who is figuring out how to build something new from the wreckage of something terrible. When that moment came in my dining room, when I saw my daughter go still and saw the man across the table from her not even bothering to fully lower his voice, I didn't think about consequences. I didn't think about relationships or holidays or keeping the peace. I thought about Emma watching from across the table. I thought about Beverly, who never got to see her daughter grow up the rest of the way, and what she would have said to me if I'd let that moment pass. I thought, not at my table, not in my house, not one more minute. A single text. 11 words. A woman who answered in 3 minutes. Sometimes that's what it takes. One person who refuses to look away. One person who knows who to call. One person who decides that peace kept at the cost of someone's safety is not peace at all. It's just silence with better table manners. You see it. You act. That's all it is. That's everything it is. Emma came back inside to report that the spinach situation was, in her professional opinion, a lost cause. And could we maybe try tomatoes next, because she felt she had a better relationship with tomatoes? Claire laughed. I got up to check on the lemon cake.